She's been asking for you for weeks, Mr. Barger. I had hoped we would see a little more of you after Halloween." Killian sighed, rubbing his temples as if there was anything there to pain him. The agency had been running him ragged lately. It seemed that for someone who was often a persona non grata, Killian was their go-to facilitator for cases they couldn't solve or, more likely, did not want to risk their other agents on. Killian had never met these mysterious higher-ups, but the longer he worked for them, the more he thought of them as bastards. When the hospital called him, he realized that he hadn't seen Madeline in nearly 5 weeks.
"The agency keeps me busy, Nurse Radcliffe, as you know."
Nurse Radcliffe was dressed for work in the tent hospitals of World War I, and her speech was as crisp as her dress. "Mr. Barger, what I understand is that you have a responsibility for this child, or have you forgotten?" Killian wanted to flash at her, but he knew she wasn't just talking to wound. He had stood before the agency board and vouched for Madeline, telling them that she was redeemable. Madeline had no clue of this, of course. She'd been in the asylum receiving treatment, but Killian knew that he hadn't forgotten. Madeline was important to him, and somewhere in the rush of cases, he'd forgotten that.
"What can you tell me about what's happened?"
As he rounded the corner and came to the entrance of her ward, however, the answers became apparent. Where the doors and glass windows should have been, there was only one door, and it looked more like the front door of a house. She has created her own premises, it would appear. Killian whistled. That was pretty serious. Ghosts could create premises from their memories pretty easily. When Killian stepped into a comfy living room, or a dirty trailer, or someone's first apartment from the 1960s, it was usually because the resident spook was broadcasting their memories over the space. It was a comfortable lie they told themselves, so they could continue to pretend that they weren't dead and live a life as usual. Killian had never seen the movie Beetlejuice, but he would have sympathized with the ghosts of the deceased couple, since they seemed incapable of projecting a premises. Ghosts who couldn't usually either moved on, or more likely, acted out and became Geists. Fewer ghosts ever created premises in the aether, the spot between life and death. A ghost might have a niche, like Killian's office, in a spot they were familiar with, but not a full-fledged premises. To create one here was like manifesting serenity at a heavy metal concert. It wasn't impossible, but God, was it difficult.
"How long has she been in there?"
Killian put a hand on the door to test its solidity. There was no give in the wood. It was as real as it had been in life. 2 days, Nurse Radcliffe said. "That's when we called you. She won't let any of us in, and there are patients trapped in there as well."
"Has anyone from the agency been informed?"
Killian was almost afraid of the answer. If the agency found out that Madeline had created her own little pocket dimension and was holding spirits hostage, there would be no arguing on her behalf this time. They would send her on, whether she was ready or not. "You're the only one from the agency we have called so far. I was hoping that someone could do something less drastic to reach her." Translation: she knew as well as Killian did what would happen if they found out what was going on here.
"I appreciate that. If I don't come back, call Carla at the agency. She'll know what to do."
Nurse Radcliffe nodded. "Good luck, Mr. Barger. I've become quite fond of that little girl, so don't you dare go in there and half-ass it." Killian winked.
"If there's one thing I'm good at, ma'am, it's whole-assing the important things."
Killian reached for the door, and when it opened, he sighed in relief. When it opened onto the foyer of a large house, Killian stepped inside and tried not to wince as it slammed shut behind him. Killian had stepped into several such places as this, but this one was by far the oddest. Not to say that Madeline's corner of reality was particularly strange, but most of the premises Killian found himself in were strange fantasy settings. Others were brooding areas, full of hurt and spoiled feelings. He had stepped into noir-esque bars, womb-like spaces with sweating walls and weeping atmospheres, all of them telling him about the spirit without saying a word. By contrast, Madeline's realm was almost mundane, but possessed a level of polish that Killian had never seen before. He walked from the sterile, dimly lit hospital corridor into the foyer of a charming Midwestern home. No home had ever existed like this, and it was more like the TV shows that Killian had often seen in his adulthood. Boots and shoes were lined up in a mudroom, and hats and coats hung off the coat hook over them. The hallways were lined with pictures of smiling children and happy families, and Madeline seemed to be present in all of them. From down the hall, Killian could hear the raised voices of laughing adults and the happy gabbling of playing children. It sounded like a party was going on down there. A party, or maybe a family reunion. Killian stepped carefully down the worn wooden boards of the hallway. He wanted to draw his gun, wanted its warm weight to reassure him, but he knew that might be a mistake. Madeline had never actually hurt him, been incapable the one time she tried, but this was not the world of the living. This was her world, and if she wanted to hurt Killian, she could. Killian realized that wit, and not a bullet, would be the winner of this day, and smartly put any thoughts of violence from his head. He wasn't even really sure he could shoot the kid in the first place. At the end of the hall was a long dining table, full of smiling faces and pleasant conversation. They were all dressed in their Sunday best, sitting around the plates of food and cups of various libations. They were all talking, but none of them seemed to be talking to each other. They were all speaking to the one who sat at the head of the table, and Killian was not surprised to find that it was Madeline. She was in a place of honor, like the queen of some tiny community, and as Killian entered, he was unsurprised to see someone that looked like him sitting on her left. His doppelganger did not seem surprised to see him either. After all, these were all constructs of Madeline's imagination, and it wasn't unthinkable that if she could not have the real Killian, she would create a pale shadow of him. Looking closer at the seated guests, however, let him know that they were not completely her constructs. Just like ghosts had death masks, Madeline had forced her will over the spirits that shared the ward with her. Beneath the face of what might be a smiling aunt was the scared visage of an enthralled spirit. Beneath the laughing mask of a cousin or an uncle was the screaming face of someone who only wanted to take their own death mask again. This was different than what Madeline had done to the children in the parking garage. She had gathered them, taking them into her embrace. These were her playthings, and they were here against their will. As he stood at the vacant end of the table, all conversations ceased. They looked like gunfighters, ready for the opening salvo, and when Madeline stood, Killian saw that she was much taller than she had been. She had grown, it seemed, without needing to grow up.
Oh, look, a guest at long last. Father, be a dear and go get him a chair.
Killian hadn't noticed him, but a man in his late 40s had been sitting on her right. He wore an expensive-looking suit, but he had paired it with one of those propeller hats you often saw on the mentally unwell. The whole image was laughable, but Killian didn't think the stylization choice had been his own. He rose, but Killian also saw his own doppelganger rise for half a second. Madeline grabbed his arm and told him to sit back down, shaking her head as she spoke softly to him, and Killian didn't have to deliberate long on what that little slip might mean.
Madeline Arlo Register.
Killian used her whole name to elicit the power that such things carried.
This has gone on long enough. Let these people go and come back with me, so that I might speak on your behalf.
Speak on my behalf? Have I done something wrong? Is it a crime to organize a dinner party with your friends and family now?
You know what you've done, Madeline. And you know that you cannot simply stay here in this delusion forever. There are rules, and there are consequences for these sorts of actions. Something we discussed in the parking garage. You remember the parking garage, don't you?
She had been smiling, giving him a look that you gave people who might be a little crazy. But when he mentioned the parking garage, the smile slid right off her face. The happy, talking people wavered like TV static, and Killian could see again the spirits that were trapped beneath that glossy coat of paint. They looked at him as if they hoped he would free them, and Killian meant to do just that, if he could manage. If he couldn't, then he supposed he might have to join this Mad Hatter's tea party himself.
I do not know what you're talking about. Killian, show this man out. I don't know who he is, but he certainly isn't one of my guests.
The false Killian rose up from the chair beside her and took a few shaky steps in the real Killian's direction. Killian looked hard, but he could see no one trapped beneath the surface of this one. As her father came back with the chair, Killian realized that he had no mannequin beneath him either. These two were not projections, but images dragged from her psyche. These were how she saw Killian and her father. Killian could see that his doppelganger had broader shoulders, a more chiseled jawline, muscular arms, and seemed to swagger like some action hero. By contrast, her father was a small and frightened man who seemed to struggle with the chair he carried. He could not hurt her the way he had hurt her in life, and that was exactly what she wanted. She wanted Killian, the brave protector, and her father, who could do little more than caper for her amusement. But things like this were often easy to shatter as snowflakes. Killian felt like a bastard already, but he knew what had to be done. "All right, buddy," the false Killian said, sounding so much like Humphrey Bogart that Killian almost rolled his eyes. "You're scaring the lady. I think it's time you go." He put a hand on Killian's shoulder, but there was no real danger in it. The hand felt like a scarecrow's cast-away glove full of useless hay. He grinned swaggeringly, sure he had him, and when Killian pulled his gun, the image didn't seem afraid in the least.
I'll give you one more chance, kid. I don't want to have to hurt you, but if you make me, then it's how it has to be.
Madeline looked scared, but the other Killian seemed sure of himself as he reached into his coat to get his own gun. The real Killian's gun was loud as it barked, and when the afterimage fell away, Madeline screamed hopelessly. The room was quiet, and many of the other images began to waver drunkenly as Madeline tried to keep her costume together. The fake Killian had fallen now, but there was no blood on him. He lay there, still grinning, and Killian wondered if he might have looked that way when he died too. Some of the dinner guests had tried to leave again, but when Madeline slammed her hands down on the table, everyone stopped.
How dare you? How dare you come into my place of refuge and treat me this way?
How dare you take people hostage like this, after all I've done to convince the agency that there's no danger in you? How dare you put yourself in danger like this? After all I've done to insulate you from the people who want to kill you, the ones that see you walk through the door and never come back.
Madeline sobbed as the tears began to run down her face in ugly lines.
You left me alone for so long. I know no one here but you. I have no purpose but to sit in this bed with nothing to occupy my time in infinity but the brief moments when you come to see me. I became hopeless. I began to compare you to my father, and the longer I sat by myself, the more the similarities seemed to make sense.
Killian wanted to be mad, but he couldn't find it in himself. She was right. He'd done exactly what her father had done for most of her childhood. He had left her someplace, left her in the care of someone, and if she was seeing ghosts of the past in his actions, then whose fault was that? He put the gun away before his hands could start to shake, and when he stepped closer to her, she looked afraid for half a heartbeat. Did she expect him to spank her or something? The thought was almost laughable, but Killian didn't dare in a place such as this. Instead, he wrapped her in a hug and felt her tears on the front of his ratty old shirt. She looked up at him, her face full of so much pain that Killian almost couldn't stand it.
I'm sorry, Killian. I didn't mean to do it. It happened slowly at first. I woke up and there was my dad. Then you showed up. But when I noticed you were different, I knew neither of you was really real. That's when I realized that I could stretch it farther and make more people. People I had only seen in pictures and never actually met. It just got away from me. Will they really send me away?
Killian wanted to say no, but he just wasn't sure.
I don't know, kid. But I do know that if we continue on like this, the next person to come in won't be as chatty as yours truly.
Madeline nodded, and everything went dark before the two of them were suddenly out in the hallway again, with Nurse Radcliffe. The doors to the ward were back, the way they should be, and inside Killian could hear people chatting confusedly, as if they weren't quite sure what was happening. Nurse Radcliffe nodded when she saw the two of them, but Killian thought there might be a ghost of a smile at the corners of her lips. It made her look almost approachable. Good. I'm glad you managed to fix this without the need for nastiness. The two of them looked at the nurse, neither of them quite sure what came next.
What's going to happen to Madeline?
She'll be transferred to another ward, said Nurse Radcliffe. And when both of them looked at her blankly, clearly not believing what she was saying, she laughed. What? You didn't think this was the first time something like this had happened? We run a hospital and a rehabilitation facility for ghosts and geists. Things like this happen more than you would expect, and are only brought to the attention of the agency in the most extreme cases. There's very little talk between wards, though, and nothing will ever be said about it. She looked at the girl sternly, though, and Killian saw even Madeline flinch under that disapproving look. I trust this will be the last time I will have to call Mr. Barger for something like this on your behalf, right? Madeline nodded, and when Nurse Radcliffe reached for her hand, she took it, but stopped before they could move more than a step or two.
Killian, will I see you soon?
Killian smiled, her desire for his company the most heartwarming thing he had ever felt. Heartwarming was no small trick when you didn't really have a heart to warm.
How about tomorrow, kid?
Madeline smiled.
I would like that.
As the two walked off, Killian leaned heavily against the wall of the hospital and sighed deeply. He was getting too old for this kind of thing. Then he thought of Madeline and her radiant smile, and decided that, old or not, he preferred it to the alternative. Good evening, everyone. It's me, Dr. Plague. Thank you so much for joining me for tonight's story. I decided to do a special little outro so that we could thank tonight's special guests. Of course, you all know the voice of Killian Barger, the Baron Landred, and reprising her role as Madeline, or Madeline, is the Lady Vengeance, a longtime friend of the show, formerly Lady Nopingham. I'm so grateful to both of them for reprising their roles, and, of course, for being such a big part of this channel. We just couldn't do the show without them. I've linked their channel details below if you'd like to go give them a look. I know that Lady Vengeance has recently restarted, and she would love your patronage just as much as I do. Speaking of patrons and people we just couldn't do the show without, let's go ahead and thank our patrons before closing out tonight. Thanks to Unicorn Hollow for being our Spooky Ghost contributor. Thanks to Janet for being our Spooky Skeleton tier contributor. And thanks to Hi Stacy, Winter, Xaronan, Emily Coltsfoot, Stephanie Carrington, Marianne Schuler, Tyler Parker, and Jennifer Damron for being our Spooky Reader tier contributors. Thanks, everyone. We just couldn't do the show without you. And without further ado, I'll leave you to enjoy the rest of your spooky evening. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.